Welcome to Crossroads. Folks, the United Kingdom, the UK, they're now moving forward with experiments to quote-unquote dim the sun. And this is going to carry out controversial programs on what's known as solar geoengineering. We've talked about it before on the show. There are many programs on it. I want to explain what it is. These are concepts being developed to fight alleged global warming, and they want to do so by reducing the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth. And there's a lot of ways they do it. The Telegraph says this. It says experiments to dim sunlight to fight global warming will be given the green light by the government in the UK within weeks. It says outdoor field trials, which could include injecting aerosols into the atmosphere or brightening clouds to reflect sunshine, are being considered by scientists as a way to prevent runaway climate change. It says ARIA, this is one of the organizations, that's the government's Advanced Research and Invention Funding Agency in the UK, has set aside £50 million for projects which will be announced in the coming weeks. It says Professor Mark Symes, the program director for ARIA, it's the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, said there would be small, controlled outdoor experiments on particular approaches, and added, we will be announcing who we have given funding to in a few weeks, and when we do so, we will be making clear when any outdoor experiments might be taking place, he said, and added, one of the missing pieces in this debate was physical data from the real world, meaning they're actually doing it. And they say models can only tell us so much. It notes as well that geoengineering projects which seek to artificially alter the climate have proven controversial, as you might imagine. It says with critics arguing they could bring damaging knock-on effects as well as being unhelpful distractions from lowering emissions. Now, according to The Guardian, this £50 million UK government-funded program, which is equivalent to about $67 million US, it will provide critical data needed to assess the potential of the technology. The program, along with another £11 million project, will make the UK one of the biggest funders of geoengineering projects in the world. Now look, there have been a few major proposals on solar geoengineering over the years. If you think this is controversial, newsflash, there are companies already doing it. There are some already doing it as we speak. This ranges anywhere from using chemicals to make clouds more reflective to lessen the amount of sunlight, meaning it shines that sunlight right back into space, to even larger things like launching barriers into space that can reduce the amount of sunlight that can reach the Earth. Notably, the World Economic Forum was promoting one of those programs. Now, look, I know some of this sounds kind of far out, but remember, there were experiments like this conducted in Mexico a couple years back. Researchers in Mexico, they're a US company, they were basically inspired by the 1991 volcanic eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. That's kind of like the model a lot of this is based on. Volcano erupts in the Philippines. It sent massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the air. It killed a lot of people. But it also had the effect of reducing sunlight. And a lot of scientists looked at that and said, wow, that reduced sunlight, maybe we can use it to fight global warming. Some scientists want to replicate the effect of a volcanic eruption artificially. And they've actually tried it out on small scales already. Some companies already do it actively, and they actually use it to sell products. Carbon credits, they call them. Now, the programs ended up being so controversial, Mexico actually banned them. Popular Mechanics, January 2023, they said this. In late 2022, the startup Make Sunsets, that's the company, one of the companies doing this, announced that it was injecting small amounts of aerosols into the stratosphere as an experiment in solar geoengineering. It says the company released 2 weather balloons from Baja California that were filled with less than 10 grams of SO2 each, not exactly Pinatubo levels, the volcano. But it said, but last week the Mexican government banned the controversial deployment of any solar geoengineering efforts, citing a 2010 moratorium developed at a United Nations conference on biodiversity. It says Make Sunsets, the company, is already, as we speak, selling cooling credits. Remember this phrase, cooling credits. They sell them for $10 per gram of SO2. And it says a similar business model to the also controversial carbon offsets, carbon credits. Now it says this: Mexico and the rest of the world has reason to worry about solar geoengineering, although its effectiveness, as seen in Punatubo, but also other global cooling periods in the distant past, can't be debated. The potential side effects of intentionally pumping the stratosphere with SO2 are disastrous. For one, scientists think that over time the skies would transform from blue to white, while sunsets would become dazzlingly bright. Make sunsets, right? As volcanoes tend to do. It says sulfur dioxide is also the same stuff pumping from power plants around the world, and this kind of geoengineering would likely induce the usual bevy of bad side effects like ozone depletion, acid rain, and respiratory illnesses. So they ban power plants from doing this and replace them with non-sustainable, sustainable energy. And then they create products to do the exact same emissions as the power plants they say that are damaging and polluting, and then use that to sell you products which you can use to offset your carbon emissions. That's business for you, folks. Now, let me actually show you a quick clip of how this works. It's literally giant balloons. They inject them with sulfur dioxide. They launch them into space, well, the stratosphere, and then they burst. Watch this. Now, look, briefly on this, a lot of people might say, oh, well, what does it matter? You know, you inject aerosols into the stratosphere, it goes away after a little bit. The reason these companies inject these things into the stratosphere and not the atmosphere, or like, lower down, the reason they do that is because it actually does stay there. It can stay there for much, much longer. And so this actually does have a very long-term impact. Now, look, briefly, though, on the note of these cooling credits, right? They call them cooling credits. The company's selling cooling credits by the gram. That doesn't mean that businesses are buying grams of like this chemical, right? The way it's done is this. They inject certain amounts of this stuff into the stratosphere, maybe X amount of grams, and then they sell that to companies to offset their carbon footprint, like hypothetically speaking, like a company sponsors it basically. The way this works, this ties into the for-profit element of climate change. There's a huge business and a huge investment area around climate change. It's a money-making scheme when it comes to this. Basically, this is how it works. Companies can purchase what they call carbon credits, or in this case, cooling credits, and they can use those credits to reach what they call net zero, meaning they have zero emissions. That doesn't mean that they actually emit nothing. It actually means that they just offset it by purchasing these grams or whatever else credits from these companies. An oil company, for example, that is determined to have an X amount of carbon emissions, they'll have to buy an equivalent amount of carbon credits or cooling credits to offset their emissions. So if they, let's say a small number, if they emit like 50 grams of carbon emissions every single day, they're going to have to buy 50 grams of carbon emissions or cooling credits from one of these companies. And these companies have all kinds of crazy things they do. There's all kinds of them. They basically look for ways where they can claim to reduce carbon emissions. That could be something like pulling carbon from the air. They have what they call carbon capture facilities, and they actually capture carbon, and then they use machines for it. They have these already built in the United States. There are proposals to cut down trees and bury the wood under the narrative that if a tree were to hypothetically burn down in a forest fire, it would create a set amount of carbon emissions. Like, how many grams is a tree, right? And so they could say if the tree were to burn down, all of that, the tree, every gram of that tree would become a carbon emission. And so by cutting the tree down and burying the tree, they stop that carbon from being emitted, and then they can sell the weight of that buried tree as a carbon credit. This is how these companies work. They put together numbers for carbon credits or cooling credits, then they sell them to other companies. A lot of big corporations have to buy them, and even some states, by the way, in order to, again, have the net zero goal. It's a huge investment area. I actually know people who work in this area. It's a huge investment area. There's tons of money in it. And, you know, some of these also get government funding, state subsidies in other parts of the world. It's not even just the US, it's like China and stuff. There are a lot of concerns around these programs themselves, like obviously, because some of these proposals, you don't really know the long-term effects of it. Like, what does it mean if you're pulling carbon out of the air? Like, what does that do to the area? There's also some companies that are a lot less credible. Because while you could say that maybe in the US there's certain environmental standards, some countries don't have that. And so in China, for example, they have, you know, they have like global warming fighting companies, and there's not a lot of stuff really vetting them. But companies can buy them and they count as credits, and so they can actually use this to offset it. Again, this is a huge business. This is part of how the whole net zero and climate change program makes money. It's a business. It's a huge investment area. A lot of investment firms are behind it. This is a huge money-making system under the narrative of climate change. That's how it works. And now look, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, they announced just last week they're actually looking into these programs. You know, they're concerned about them. Specifically, the company Make Sunsets. That's the company I mentioned before that's launching the balloons to inject sulfur dioxide into the air. The EPA said this in an official statement. It said the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA Office of Air and Radiation, OAR, submitted a demand for information to a startup company calling themselves Make Sunsets, which is launching balloons filled with sulfur dioxide seeking to geoengineer the planet and generate cooling credits to sell. Again, they're selling them, right? It's a business. They say this issue was initially identified in 2023 during the last administration. The Biden administration actually did do some studies on this, but it said no action was taken to find out more about this questionable startup and activity. And notes that EPA Administrator Zeldin said, quote, the idea that individuals supported by venture capitalists, as I mentioned, there's a huge investment business behind this, are putting criteria air pollutants into the air to sell cooling credits shows how climate extremism is overtaking common sense. Again, the things they're injecting into the air to fight climate change are some of the same exact emissions from the power plants they've tried to shut down because they've alleged the emissions are causing climate change. Let that sink in. Anyways, Lee Zeldin continues stating this. He said, based on Make Sunset's responses to our information requests, we will look into all our authorities to ensure that we will continue maintaining clean air for all Americans. Now look, according to the company's website, Make Sunsets, they've already launched around 147 balloons. It says they've delivered over 128,000 so-called cooling credits. Personally, I doubt this company is going to like single-handedly cause a volcanic eruption type scenario where like you block the sun. But, you know, the concern is if this continues spreading, right? And this is raising some questions over exactly what they've been doing, any potential impacts these programs may have had on the environment. Again, there's not enough studies on this for like long-term impact. They do state on their website, quote, we hope you'll join our journey by purchasing a cooling credit, signing up for our newsletter, or partnering with us. Let's work together to cool our planet for future generations. Again, you know, there are a lot of people who believe the climate change narrative, and they view this as saving the world. There are many people who believe that. But back to the experiment soon to be underway in the UK, right, the United Kingdom. It also comes with a lot of controversies, as you would imagine. There are concerns that reducing sunlight could have a detrimental impact on the world. Maybe even like a pseudo-Armageddon type scenario. Maybe not that severe, but based on human civilization and human history, we've seen what happens when there have been massive volcanic eruptions. especially if you have the machine of business behind it, and there's no brakes on that train, right? This is given the fact that sunlight has been shown in the past to, reducing sunlight. If you reduce the amount of sunlight, what happens? Well, crops die, farms fail. It can even cause plagues, diseases. Some of the worst times in human history were the times following massive volcanic eruptions when less sunlight was hitting the earth. You had disease, you had war, you had suffering, you had death and famine. But there are programs looking to effectively replicate that. Some companies want to artificially replicate that effect. You could argue maybe not that severe. The question is, well, what determines when they hit the brakes on it, and what stops them from continue doing it indefinitely, right? Their argument is that they, got to fight global warming. They're saving the world, even if it means damaging, some other things. One of the major proposals for this that actually went viral a few years back, this was tied to an experiment funded by, in part by billionaire Bill Gates, and it was to spray aerosols into the stratosphere. They wanted to use big jets to do it, fly high, and inject these things into the stratosphere. Some people said it's, chemtrails or whatever. Technically it was, but they were doing this actually. They ran experiments on it. CNBC covered this. This was not a conspiracy theory. Let me show you their actual video. This is September 2019. Watch.
Meanwhile, Bill Gates is backing the first high-altitude experiment of one radical climate change solution, creating a massive chemical cloud that could cool the Earth. It's called solar geoengineering, and it's highly controversial.
How long will it be that countries keep experiencing these climate impacts before someone gets desperate and says, hey, we need to cool the planet with solar geoengineering?
It would look something like this. Thousands of planes would fly very high and use nozzles to inject millions of tons of light-reflecting particles into the stratosphere. It would create a thin chemical cloud of those particles around the whole planet, blocking some sunlight from reaching the surface. It would mimic a giant volcanic eruption, which we know cools the Earth. Back in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. It was the largest eruption to affect a densely populated area, creating avalanches and giant mud flows that left more than 700 dead and 30,000 homeless. It also spewed a cloud of 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide particles into the stratosphere. That chemical cloud was hundreds of miles across and reflected about 2% of sunlight back to space. And in 1992, the Earth was cooler than in 1991.
That is part of the mechanism, but you do this in a controlled way.
Modeling studies have found that it could reduce the intensity of heat waves, for instance. Apparently it could reduce the rate of sea level rise. It could reduce the intensity of tropical storms.
But it also comes with significant risks and uncertainties.
Things like mass famine, mass flooding, drought, of kinds that will affect very large populations.
It could weaken.
Now, to be clear, experiments like this have continued. This was not like a one-off thing. Just last year, for example, researchers tested a small-scale program in San Francisco, right here in the good old US of A, folks. The experiment was actually done on the deck of a US aircraft carrier. The Biden administration, they actually issued a statement at the time saying that the government was not involved in that experiment because it was controversial. Although a couple years prior, 2023, the previous administration released a public report in the United States about solar geoengineering and similar programs, saying they're effectively researching it. Does not mean they were doing it, but they were researching it. They were not announcing plans to actually test the technologies, but there were public reports on this. Now, U.S. Congress also had a report on the proposed technologies for solar geoengineering also back in 2023. And it discussed most of the main proposals going around, right? They kind of analyzed it. Will this be good? Will it be bad? And there were reports on it. It also noted some of the potential risks and explored whether there were any laws blocking these types of programs. Because, one of the concerns is, you can ban it in the United States, but what's going to stop another country from doing it, like the UK, for example? Just recently also, Florida took actions to ban these types of programs. This was just recently. In fact, this is still going through. Several U.S. states are looking to ban these types of programs, including cloud seeding, which is something they use to induce rain, for example. It's called conspiracies. Some states are looking to ban it, and the people who say it's conspiracies are saying it's a conspiracy, but you can't stop us from doing it, which is a bit weird. But look, a lot of news outlets have somewhat misrepresented this. They allege that Florida, the Senate was basically banning, conspiratorial programs on chemtrails and things like that. They misrepresented these programs as, chemtrails. CNN reported in late March that, quote, an unsubstantiated conspiracy theory that claims the U.S. government is controlling the weather or its citizens by spraying dangerous chemtrails from airplanes has now made its way into several state legislatures where it can manifest into real-life laws. And there's actually more to that, as you would imagine. The measure was actually passed in the Florida Senate. It's now in the House in Florida at the state level. And basically what that does, again, if you read the actual law and you're not just writing whatever, right? What it actually does, it prohibits any person or corporation from engaging in geoengineering or weather modification. So that would include things like cloud seeding, which they use to induce rain. There are a lot of programs like that. It's actually very common in countries like Dubai. China does it all the time. It would also include any potential programs in things like solar geoengineering. And it also makes it a third-degree felony if an aircraft controller or operator does this. And they could be punished by up to 5 years in prison. They get a $5,000 fine. It's a relatively serious crime if this passes the House and gets signed into law. It also makes it generally illegal to inject or release chemicals or other substances into the atmosphere to impact the climate. And that's the actual technicality of the law. This is not about like chemtrails or anything like that, right? Although it would hypothetically include that if that's a thing. While programs like this, though, are banned in Mexico, several U.S. states are looking to ban them. To be clear, they're not illegal everywhere. There are many areas in the world this is not illegal. Many areas in the world are doing it, and many areas in the world are looking to experiment with it. The United Kingdom, for example, again, they are now moving forward with experimenting on solar geoengineering to, quote-unquote, dim the sun. That said, folks, thank you so much for being here. Please take care of yourselves, stay informed, stay free. Thank you.